We have a nugget from freelance science writer Moheb Kastandi, and it's published in Big Think, July 2023.
Okay.
Headline is Neuroscientist loses a 25-year bet on consciousness to a philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
Will we ever unravel the mystery of consciousness? Two academics made a 25-year bet on it, and the scientists lost. 25 years ago, two academics made a bet about consciousness. Christof Koch, a neuroscientist, wagered David Chalmers, a philosopher, that the brain mechanisms underlying consciousness would be known by 2023. Chalmers thought otherwise.
Yeah, now Chalmers, it mentions that he's a philosopher, but really he's got a position at NYU that has everything to do with understanding consciousness and the brain and all this kind of stuff. So it's really his field.
When they made the bet, many scientists were busy using newly developed neuroimaging technology to search for what they called the neural correlates of consciousness, defined by Koch in a recent interview with the Swedish science magazine Forskning and Framsteg.
Yes.
The footprints of consciousness in the organ of consciousness, which is the brain.
Okay, so let's just start by. It seems like they're going in with the presumption that it will be found there.
Right? Yeah, you'll be able to see it with neuroimaging, just like you can see. They can see. Like someone had a seizure. You'll be able to see that in the brain.
Yes, and so they're making. How did it phrase it? The two academics made a bet about consciousness. They wagered that the brain mechanisms underlying consciousness would be known. How do you know that there are brain mechanisms that underlie consciousness?
It's like
unless you don't have any evidence for it, right? So why make that assumption?
Koch and Chalmers agreed to set up a series of studies by rival consciousness researchers who would collaborate on experiments designed to test each other's ideas about how the brain generates consciousness. The preliminary results of some of these experiments were presented at the 26th annual meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, held recently at New York University, where Chalmers now directs the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness.
There you go.
The results presented at the ASSC meeting showed that both theories are still incomplete. In other words, neuroscientists do not understand consciousness. So during the main event, Koch appeared on stage to present Chalmers with a case of fine wine.
Okay.
Can't figure it out? Let's get drunk.
But that was the bet.
Yeah.
But and they also, several things are in that article or in similar articles. It was a big deal when this happened in the science world, right? They made a bet in 98, right? One said that, yeah, it'll all be mapped out. It'll all be clearly defined how consciousness is generated in the brain. And the other person says, the other person believes that. Chalmers, that's his faith. And we could call it that faith, that's his faith because he doesn't have evidence for it. But he just believes that it's too subtle and too difficult to figure out, that it wouldn't be figured out within 25 years. So the 25 years passed. They set these two rival consciousness research teams, and actually many others. There's something like 6 teams working intensely on the problem from different angles. And none of them were able to do it. And really they kind of established, when they were on stage, they said something like, they defined what would be satisfying evidence, and within that was there'd be clear demonstration of this or that. And I think what Chalmers said was, what's clear is that everything's unclear. and Koch had to agree with that, or Koch had to agree with that. The hard problem with consciousness, because there's a soft problem and the hard problem. The easier the soft problem is just, can we find an exact correlation between brain activity and consciousness? And then the hard question is, can we show how the brain actually generates consciousness? And the first problem, the easy problem, they said, is actually quite hard. Even that part they can't figure out. And I would say to that, when you go in, no matter how learned these people are, or how high their IQs are, how studied they are, it doesn't mean that they necessarily think in a way that's entirely unbiased or entirely fair or entirely logical. Because again, they're going into this with an assumption. Once you do that, why not go into it with the idea like we have no idea where consciousness comes from? Let's see what we can find by looking at the brain. But they went into it with the idea, let's go into the brain and find out how it generates consciousness. It's a very different approach in one sense. And that assumption or presumption can color the way that you process the evidence that you find. But even with that potential bias, they still were not able to discover anything. And they even found that what they thought would be easy was far more difficult or complicated than they had assumed. Given that the easy problem is actually hard, the really hard problem of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective conscious experience probably will remain unsolved for a very long time to come. Perhaps it will never be solved. Perhaps it's not true. Are we willing to consider that? Perhaps it'll never be solved because consciousness is not generated within the brain. And I've always thought that, let's say they even kind of discovered the soft problem or the easy problem of consciousness. Let's say they were able to kind of draw parallels between brain activity and consciousness and show, look, it's happening in this part of the brain right here and right now. But couldn't that be very similar to discovering music in a radio? It's like one could say that this box generates music. Well, actually, there was a musician who was the source of that music, right?
Right. That's a great analogy.
They recorded it in a studio, and it was sent as a signal to that box. And you're discovering it within the box and assuming that its origin is within the box. Right? They got to think outside the box.
Never going to figure it out. You got to think outside the box. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So there were yogis who were scientists of consciousness. They're experimenting with consciousness, going back. Is according to texts like Bhagavatam, as far back as forever, practically. And you could go up into the mountains of the Himalaya mountains and into quiet little hermitages way up there, and those yogis would have told you 5,000 years ago that consciousness is a separate type of energy. It's not generated within the brain. It can't be generated. It's eternal. It's something that you can't deconstruct. It's something, it's made of an entirely different type of energy that can't be picked up with the material senses or even the extensions of those senses in the form of microscopes or this kind of technology, electric technology that they're using. It's an entirely different type of energy. And you can come back 10,000 years from now and you're going to find yogis up in those mountains saying the same thing. What the yogis claim is coming from the manual of the universe, right? From the Veda, from a source of knowledge that can be downloaded, that gives us this kind of stuff that is otherwise achintya, is otherwise inconceivable to us, right? You can infer so much about consciousness, and what they infer lines up very nicely, and all fits together, and you can practice those experiments in consciousness. You can practice yoga and meditation and so on and feel the results, but you're not going to be able to ever, according to them, ever show how this brain generates it, because the brain doesn't generate it. It's eternal.